This video is a summary of all of paper 1 in under an hour. First topic is the CPU. This stands for Central Processing Unit. The purpose of the CPU is to run the FDE cycle. That's the fetch, decode, execute cycle. It fetches instructions and data, processes them, and executes instructions. The factors affecting the performance are clock speed, number of cores, and cache size, and we'll go through these in a moment. And there are two main types of CPU architecture. The one that you need to know is called von Neumann. There are various components of a CPU. The main one is the control unit. This is what executes the program instructions and also controls the flow of data in the CPU. The ALU, or arithmetic logic unit, completes all calculations and performs any logical operations such as AND, or not. The cache is a part of memory inside the CPU. It's very fast memory and it stores regularly used data and instructions. Here is a diagram of the von Neumann architecture. Essentially what von Neumann means is there's one memory for both the data and the instructions to be stored in one particular place. Harvard architecture has a separate one for each. You just need to know that von Neumann has the data and instructions stored in the same memory. Now the von Neumann architecture is set out like we can see here in the diagram, and you will see all of the different components that we've just discussed, like control unit, ALU, and not actually displayed on this one is the cache, but this would be inside the CPU. Now what you will now notice is that there are lots of registers that have been added in. We can see the program counter, the accumulator, and the MAR, MDR, and CIR. Now you don't actually need to know the CIR until A level, but it's important to know that there is one and it does exist. Okay, what a register basically is it's a very fast piece of memory inside the CPU, and they hold tiny bits of data. And these bits of data are going to be used during the FDE cycle. So we need to just kind of understand what each of the different registers actually does. The program counter holds the address of the next instruction to be fetched. Now what that means is no matter what stage you are at the fetch, decode, execute cycle, the program counter will always be holding the next instruction to be fetched. Once that instruction has been fetched, it will increment, and therefore it is now pointing to the next instruction. The MAR holds any address, so that's an easy one to remember. MAR is the address to be used by the CPU. The MDR holds the actual data or the instruction, and that's why it's called memory data. The CIR holds the current instruction. And finally, the ACC, which is called the accumulator, this stores the values and the results from any calculations that the ALU performs. So for this entire section, you essentially need to know all of the different components inside. A good way of doing this is to remember PAC-MAM, P-A-C-M-A-M, and then that will help you to remember all of the different components. For PC, ACC, CU, MAR, ALU, and MDR, and in this table is everything that you need to know for the definition of what it does. So the CPU actually performs the FDE cycle, and this is what happens at each stage. So if you were asked 4 things that occur during the FDE cycle, you can choose anything from this diagram. The first thing is that you fetch the instruction, and you can pick anything that happens during that stage to put down as an action. You've also got the decode stage, which is basically when you translate the instructions into something that the computer understands. And then you've got the execute stage, which is where you actually do the instruction, whether that's calculating something or running a particular program. So now we'll look at the 3 factors affecting performance. Clock speed is the number of instructions the processor can carry out in 1 second. In other words, how many FDE cycles can it complete? It's measured in hertz, and most modern CPUs are running at gigahertz speeds. That means they can do billions of instructions per second. The higher the clock speed, the higher or the more instructions that can be processed per second. In other words, the bigger the number for the clock speed, the faster the CPU will run. Number of cores refers to how many independent CPUs are inside the computer. So a CPU can have multiple cores inside, and each core can process the data independently. They have their own FDE cycle. They don't need any more space or any separate power, which is perfect for not making the device any bigger. Cache size refers to the amount of cache memory inside your CPU. Since cache stores commonly used instructions, this means that the more cache that you have, the faster your CPU can run, because it's got more of the fastest memory. This means it needs to communicate less with RAM, and cache is usually faster than RAM, therefore it will run faster if you've got more cache. An embedded system is where a computer is built into another device. They're used as control systems to monitor and control machinery. Usually they're dedicated to one particular single task. This means that they're easier to design, they're cheaper to make, and they're more efficient because there's less problems that can go wrong with the actual computer. Examples are going to be things like a washing machine or a dishwasher, a microwave, and an inbuilt menu on a TV. Random access memory, or RAM for short, is the main memory in a computer system. It's a type of primary memory because it's the first stage of memory that the CPU comes in contact with. It's main memory in a computer system where the data, files and programs are kept while being used. RAM is much faster than secondary storage. RAM is also volatile. That means that the data is lost if you turn the power off. Read-only memory is stored on a microchip on the motherboard. It contains all the instructions for the computer to start up. In other words, it holds the boot up sequence. The instructions are called BIOS, Basic Input Output System. An embedded system could be stored on a ROM chip inside the microwave or a washing machine. ROM is non-volatile. That means the data remains when you turn the power off. Virtual memory is when you use part of the secondary storage as extra RAM memory. You only use this when the system runs out of available RAM. This usually happens when you run lots of programs all at the same time on an operating system. Virtual memory is much slower, so it's something that you don't want to use frequently. Secondary storage is where files and applications are stored long term. This means that when you open something up in RAM, when you've got it open on your computer, it's open up in RAM. But when you turn the computer off, whatever is in RAM is lost. But the secondary storage is where you will save those files and applications long term. There are three types of secondary storage that we need to know: optical, magnetic, and solid state. Each of these you would decide which to use based on some characteristics. And the characteristics are the capacity, the speed, durability, reliability, how much power they use, and how much it costs per megabyte of storage. You can see here with some star ratings which ones are better than others. Solid state is usually the best type of storage to use for most situations because it's the fastest, it's the most durable, it uses the least amount of power, and the price of it is starting to decrease, although at the moment it is still the most expensive. Optical discs are really good in terms of portability because you can carry them around, and also you can look at things like the storage capacity, how you will more than likely get more storage capacity with magnetic compared to solid state. So the storage methods that are available are magnetic, optical, and solid state. Magnetic is when mechanical parts move over the disks to read and write data magnetically. This makes them quite large, use a lot of power, and be quite chunky. The other thing is if you drop them or use any sort of high magnetic charge, you can damage the data. Optical disks use lasers to read and write the data using light. Solid state, this is also called flash memory, is recorded onto solid memory chips without any moving parts. This means that they're very durable, use less power, and are a lot smaller. Operating systems are the system that essentially manages everything on your device. Examples of an operating system would be Windows, iOS, and Android. They do lots of different things, but these are the main ones that you should be able to explain. Manage hardware devices and peripherals. This means that you can plug any device into the machine and it will work. You can do this because it installs drivers to allow the communication between the device and your peripheral that you've plugged in. Another thing it does is it gives the user an interface, for example a GUI, where you can click on icons and rename folders and whatever it is that you need to do. You can see what you're actually doing when communicating with the computer. This is because we don't speak binary, so we need some sort of interface to communicate with the device. It also provides a platform for programs to run, in other words, run applications. And it manages files and storage. This means that we can create folders and rename them, etc. Finally, it lets us have user accounts, which means different people can log into the machine. Utility software is software that's used to keep a computer running with optimum efficiency. In other words, it helps to maintain the computer and keep it in good working order. The examples of utility software are antivirus, firewall, compression, encryption, defragmentation, backup, and auto updates. Most of these are pretty obvious what they do, so you should be able to write an explanation. The only one that you might struggle to remember is defragmentation. What this does is it groups files or programs and free space together. In other words, similar files will all be grouped together in one place, and this will free up some free area that you can save files to. By grouping everything together, it also decreases the time the disk has to spend loading and saving information. Final topic for anything to do with computer systems and software is open source and proprietary. Open source is software where you have access to the code. This has many advantages, mainly because it's usually free and it's adaptable and customizable, as in you can edit the code. You can collaborate with other people and try to contribute new things to the actual code. And also there's usually a community where you can get help with it. The disadvantages is it might have bugs in the code because it's not paid for, it's all free, and you don't know who's edited it. That means it might also lack security. You've also got limited user guides. In other words, you have to kind of figure out how to use it yourself. You don't have any warranty, so if something breaks, there's nothing at all you can do about it. And there's no real official support for the open source code. Proprietary software is when you purchase the software, which means you don't have any access to the code at all. Now this has obvious benefits, is it's usually well tested, you get a warranty with it, it's cheaper than making it yourself, and also it usually have extra features. The disadvantages is that it's obviously expensive, you've got to pay for it, you can't configure it or change it, and there's usually less support for any older versions. For the two different types of networks, we've got LANs and WANs. LAN is local area network, WAN is wide area network. The two differences between them are a local area network is in a small geographical area, and a wide area network is in a large geographical area, which usually is to connect LANs together. The other difference is that the hardware is owned by whoever owns the LAN. So in other words, inside the building or school or university, anything like that it's in, it's that organization that owns the hardware. In a WAN, The equipment or all of the infrastructure is owned by an internet service provider. The internet is an example of a WAN. There are various factors that affect the performance of a network. Number one is the bandwidth. This is the amount of data that you can upload, download in 1 second. Obviously, that is a huge factor affecting the performance of your internet or network speed. Second one is that wired connections are much faster than wireless. Third, it depends when you are wired, which cable you are using. Fiber optic is obviously the best cable. 4 is wireless can have physical obstructions. So if you are wireless, one of the things affecting your performance could be that you've got walls or ceilings blocking the wireless signal. Number 5, wireless signal decreases with range. So the further away you get from the router, the signal will decrease. Number 6 is the amount of people actually using the network. So that could be if you've got 5 people downloading videos at the same time, it's going to be much slower than 3. Number 7, the type of topology is another thing that affects the performance. Star is a lot faster than mesh. A client-server network is where a digital device is connected to a server. Sometimes, or usually, this will go through another device called a switch. A client connects to a network to request things like data from that server. So anytime you process any sort of request, it's the server that responds. In other words, if you open up a website, you will send a request to the server and the server will process it and send that website back to you. Multiple devices can connect to one server, and that is usually through the switch. Most of the internet works on a client-server relationship. Peer-to-peer is another form of network setup, and this is where the network is formed by connecting the devices together. This means that there's no central point of connection. There is no server involved. Now this is really useful for sharing files and video conferencing. All the devices have equal rights. You might use something like this at home for connecting devices or sharing a printer. It's when there is no central point of failure. Star topology is the layout of the actual network, and this is used for a client-server network. So client-server is essentially the same as a star topology, but the topology is the actual layout. You can see on the diagram the way it's got one with images in and one without. One is an abstracted version of the diagram where it just shows the actual layout. All the devices are connected to a central switch or server. This helps to form the star-looking shape. The central switch allows many devices to access the server simultaneously. Star networks may be wired or wireless, and they're mainly used for LANs. The star topology has got various different advantages and disadvantages. The main one is that if one device fails, the rest of the network is completely unaffected. That means it's also easy to add more devices to that network. All the devices can transmit data at exactly the same time, which means you get fewer data collisions. The disadvantages of a star network is that it can be expensive, whereas in wired networks, every device needs a cable to connect to the central switch or server. If there is a problem with the switch or server, then the whole network is affected. In other words, there is a central point of failure. A mesh topology is where all of the devices are connected together. You can have a partial mesh where almost all are connected and there might be one that isn't. This could be something like a printer not being connected to every device. The thing with a mesh topology is it's decentralized, meaning that there's no central point of failure. This is mainly used for WANs so that we can have packet switching across the internet. The disadvantages of a mesh is that you've got to put lots and lots of wires in so that everything is connected up to each other. Now there is some advantages, which is that there's no need for one central switch or server, which means that there's no single point of failure where the whole network can go down. You can also send data along the fastest route from one device to another. The hardware needed for any sort of network to be set up, the most important thing is that every device has got a NIC, that's a network interface controller. It's an internal piece of hardware that allows a device to connect to a network. Each NIC has got its own MAC address. This used to be a separate card, but now it's inbuilt to most devices. It can be wired or wireless. A switch is an intelligent piece of hardware that connects devices together on a LAN. It receives the data from one device and it can transmit the data to another device on the network. They use MAC addresses to do this. Usually a server will have many switches connected into the server, and it will use this to be able to connect hundreds of computers to the one server. A router is responsible for the transmission of data between networks. They have a crucial role and do many different things. First of all, they assign IP addresses to the devices on the LAN. They receive packets, they direct packets to their destination, and they are often used in homes and offices to connect the LAN to the internet. There are three different cable types that you need to know. There are Ethernet cables, which are actually called Cat5 or Cat6 cables. These are the most common type and they're used to connect devices in a LAN. Usually they'll go from the NIC in your computer and go into a switch. They are twisted pair cables containing 4 pairs of copper wire, and that means that they're all twisted to shield them from any sort of interference. They have a pretty fast speed, but they're not the fastest. The coaxial wire is usually used for TV and satellite, and this is the slowest of the three. And fiber optic transmits data as light, which means they are the fastest and very high performance. They do not suffer any interference. These can be used over huge distances without losing quality. The internet works using something called a domain name server, and this allows us to use a web browser to browse the www, the World Wide Web. So a domain name server looks up and translates the website's domain name. So when you type in www.bbc.com, the DNS looks up that website's address and returns the IP address back to you. This allows you to actually access the website. The whole reason why we use it is because you are very unlikely to be able to remember lots of specific IP addresses. So it looks up the URL, gets the IP address and returns it back to your browser. The cloud is when anything uses the internet to store files and applications. Web hosting is when a business uses its servers to store files of another organization. The most common use is to host websites on other people's servers like Wix.com or Ionos. The cloud has some really good benefits. It means that you can access your files or applications 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world. It also means that we can do things like collaborate on documents. The disadvantage with the cloud is it's reliant on an internet connection. Wi-Fi is a method of wireless transmission. It's the standard for wireless networks. Wi-Fi uses two radio frequency bands, 2.4 and 5 GHz. The bands are split into numbered channels that cover a small range. Wi-Fi performance is affected by interference. 5 GHz is a lot faster, but it's more affected by the interference. In other words, if you're very, very close to your wireless access point, you could use 5 GHz because you're less likely to be affected by interference. But if you are going to go into a few rooms away from the wireless access point, then you would want to use 2.4 GHz because it's less likely to be affected. Bluetooth is another wireless connection method, and this is usually between two devices. It only has a 10-meter range. It's often used for mobile phones to connect to cars or headphones. It's also used for game controllers like Xbox and PlayStation. MAC addresses are a unique number that's given to every device. Every network interface controller has a unique MAC address, and this is used to make sure that the data goes to the correct place. A LAN switch usually reads the MAC address and makes sure that the data goes to the correct place. MAC addresses use hexadecimal and is usually six pairs of 2-digit hexadecimal values. An IP address is used to send data between networks. These are not usually linked to a specific device. The IP address is assigned by the router and it can be 32-bit or 128 bits. Most web addresses that are been around for a while have got a 32-bit IP address. These are the ones that you're most likely seen many times. They have got 4 denary numbers separated by full stops. An example is shown here, 172.16.254.1. Each of those denary numbers are converted into binary, and that is the IP address for that website. Protocols are sets of rules used to communicate on the internet. The TCP/IP protocol is the main protocol used. This dictates how data is sent between networks. TCP sets the rules for how devices connect. It essentially splits the data into packets, reassembles the packets, and checks if everything's been sent properly. The Internet Protocol is responsible for packet switching. That means that TCP organizes everything and IP actually sends it. There are quite a few other protocols that you need to be aware of. You don't have to explain them in massive detail, but you need to know what they are. So these are protocols. They are essentially a type of standard. Standards are when the rules for communication are the same on all computers. We have people that speak many different languages all around the world. We need to make sure that for the internet to work, every computer understands each other. So standards allow hardware and software to interact across different manufacturers and producers. The other protocols that you need to know are HTTP and HTTPS. These are both used to access websites, but HTTPS is for when the website is being encrypted. FTP is used to transfer files between different devices on a network. POP3 and IMAP are both used to access emails, but POP3 downloads it to the device and IMAP retains the information on the server. SMTP is used to send emails. For this specification, you just need to be aware of a concept of layers. So a layer is a group of protocols which have similar functions. So the concept of layers is that all of the layers are self-contained and they have protocols in every separate layer that does their job. Each layer serves the next layer. So basically it's like going through a set of stages, and if anything goes wrong at any particular stage, you know which layer it's gone wrong at. This has lots of benefits. The benefits of using layers is that it means it breaks down network communication into manageable pieces. So if anything goes wrong, developers can concentrate on their own area. It also means that if you ever make any changes, one layer could change and it won't affect the others. And it also means that we have set rules for each layer, which means that universal hardware and software can be possible. Now we have to look at some threats to data. The first threat that you need to know is a brute force attack. A brute force attack is when you keep trying lots and lots of passwords until one might actually work. A virus is a type of malware which is installed without your knowledge with the purpose of doing harm. A virus is a program which infects other programs or data files. It's easily spread even if you do it by accident and send an infected file to someone else. A worm is another type of malware, but this is a standalone program. It doesn't need to attach itself to an existing program in order to spread. In other words, it doesn't need to attach the files, it can spread around the network. Denial of service attack is when people attempt to flood a server with an overwhelming number of requests. This takes the server down and makes it inoperable. Social engineering is when you manipulate people into giving you private information. This could be logins and passwords. Two common techniques are phishing and shoulder surfing, which is where you look over someone's shoulder. Phishing is harmful emails where they will send you some sort of link to try and get information from you. An SQL injection is when you type SQL code into input boxes to try and gain information. A very simple example, which probably wouldn't work, but as an example, you could do select star from username and get everybody's username from that database. One method of preventing against attacks is to have strong passwords. These must be more than 8 characters long, have a combination of upper and lowercase, numbers and special characters. You should also not include any personal information. An obvious prevention is anti-malware software. Antivirus software could be installed on all computers, and automatic updates are commonly used to keep it up to date. New viruses are constantly being created and spread, and an update to the antivirus will make sure that it is protected. A firewall is another successful prevention, and it is essentially where you scan and filter any harmful packets coming into the network. This prevents hackers and man-in-the-middle attacks. You can also set up something called user access levels, which means access rights are given to people with different settings. In other words, a perfect example would be in a school where teachers have more rights to edit files than students do, and there will be people like the head teacher who have access to even more. Final prevention is encryption. Not all data can be prevented from somebody getting hold of it, so encryption is a very successful way of making sure that no one can read the data. Simple shift cipher might move each letter by 3 places in the alphabet, and without knowing how many letters it's moved, you wouldn't really be able to understand the information. Encryption scrambles up the data so it can't be read. It's important that you know the sizes, the units of data sizes, and how big they are in smallest to largest. So 1 bit is obviously the smallest unit. A nibble is 4 bits. These are used for hexadecimal units. Then we've got 8 bits is 1 byte. 1000 bytes is a kilobyte. 1000 kilobytes is a megabyte. 1000 megabytes is a gigabyte, and 1000 gigabytes is a terabyte. Now, one easier way to understand this is that kilo is 1000, mega is million, giga is billion, and tera is trillion. Everything we do on a computer ends up in ones and zeros. Computers use logic circuits using 1 and 0 to show high and low voltage. Bi means 2 or twice in Latin. So if you think of all of the words that start with bi, bisect, biweekly, bicycle, bifocals, everything's to do with 2. 1 means electricity is flowing on, and 0 means no electricity is flowing, which is off. That's why power buttons have 1 or 0 written on them. We need to be able to convert between binary to denary and denary to binary. If you can't do this at this point, you're probably going to want to watch a different video. This is just for revision purposes. The best thing to do is to draw out the conversion table on the exam paper to make sure that you definitely get everything right. If you are given a number in binary, you put the binary number into the table and add up all the numbers where there is a 1 underneath. For this example, you add 64, 16, 4 and 2 to get 86. So that binary number is 86 in denary. To reverse it and do it the other way around, we've got denary to binary. To do this, you basically need to subtract every number that you use. Another way of doing it is if you think about which numbers you need to add up to get the number 93. If you look at the biggest number that goes into 93, it's 64, so you take that away, put a number 1 in, take it away, and just repeat the steps until you get to 0. Or you can figure out which numbers you need to add up to get to 93. Binary addition. Again, if you can't do this, you might want to watch a different video. This is just to remind you that you need to do all of the additions but also show the carry bits. Whenever you get 1 and a 1 to 1 plus 1, you need to put 0 and carry the 1 over. Whenever you get 1 plus 1 plus 1 in a column, you need to put 1 and carry the 1 over, and that's how it works. Again, if this is just revision, if you don't know how to do it, go and watch the video about binary additions. To do binary shifts, the easiest possible thing to do is cross off the numbers for whichever way you need to move it. So if you need to move a number to the right, then you just cross off the digit that you've used and move everything over and put a 0 at the beginning. If you want to move it to the left, then you cross out the digits at the left that you've used and move everything over and put zeros at the end. Again, if you don't know how to do this, go and watch the video. This is just a quick recap to show you what is happening. Binary shift right is halving the number, and a binary shift left is doubling the number, and that's how we do multiplication and division. To convert into hexadecimal, this could be from denary or from binary, you need to know what each hexadecimal digit is. So it's essentially 0 to 9. However, once we get to 10, it becomes A, B, C, D, E and F. I recommend writing all of these out on the exam paper. So literally write from 0 all the way up to 15 and make sure you label 10 to 15 as the correct letter. This will stop you making any silly mistakes. Since this is just a revision video, if you're not sure how to do the hexadecimal conversions, just go and watch the videos on that. But essentially, if you get given a number in denary, you can just put it into binary like you've just done before, and then you split it into 2 separate nibbles and work out each nibble individually. Once you've got each nibble into a denary number, you just convert any number larger than 9 into its hexadecimal counterpart. So in this particular case, you've got 106, you put it into binary, split it in 2. The nibble on the left is 4 and 2, which is 6. Nibble on the right is 8 and 2, which is 10. And we know that 10 is A. So 106 in hexadecimal is 6A. For this particular exam, you need to know how images are represented on a computer. So this is a very simple diagram to kind of illustrate that. Each pixel within an image, so every image is broken down into tiny dots called pixels. Each pixel is given a binary value. Each value represents a different color. In this particular case, we've only got 2 possible values, either black or white. 1 for black, 0 for white. And if you zoom out on that image, you will see that it is a small sailboat. Now within each pixel, the amount of 1s and 0s used to represent each pixel is called the color depth. Now this basically is how many colors are you allowed within each individual pixel. The more 1s and 0s that you have is the more color combinations. For example, 1 bit, as you've just seen, is either black or white, 2 colors. If you have 2 bits, like 1, 0 or 0, 0 for each pixel, then you can have 4 colors. And it basically increases every time you increase the number of bits. You can work it out using 2 to the power of n, where n is the number of bits per pixel. For example, 2 to the power of 4 is 16. 2 to the power of 24, which is what we use, RGB, red, green and blue, is 16.7 million possible colors. In the image on this slide, you can see the effect of a color depth. So the more colors that you have available, the more clearer the image becomes. Another thing that affects the quality of an image is the resolution. This is the number of pixels in an image. The higher you make the resolution, the more pixels there are in a certain area, which means there's a better quality image. This is usually measured in dots per inch. You can see across the bottom what happens in a small area of an image, what happens when you increase the resolution. The more pixels there are in a certain area, the better the quality is. To work out the size of an image, you have to multiply the resolution, essentially. You count the number of pixels going across by the number of pixels going down, and that will be the total number of pixels in an image. Then you would multiply that by the color depth, how many bits there are per pixel, and you will have the total amount of size for the image. In order for the computer to understand what the ones and zeros actually are, it uses something called metadata to help it recreate the actual picture or sound. So metadata is the extra information stored in a file. It helps the computer recreate the image or sound using the binary data. Examples are what file format it is, the width and height of the image, the color depth of the image, the resolution of the image, the time, date, or anything like when it's been edited, and also the duration of an audio file and the sample rate of an audio file. Sound sampling is when you are converting an analog sound into digital, and sound sampling is when you take the height of the sound wave and at set intervals. So in other words, you take samples of the sound wave. The height is a numerical value. As you can see in this diagram, on the 1 second, the height of the wave is 8, and then those numbers are converted into binary and stored on the computer. So after 1 second, it's 8, after 2 seconds, it's 3, and so on, and you convert these numbers into binary. The resulting string of binary digits is what the computer sees. When we've got all these ones and zeros, it can take up an awful lot of space. So we can use something called compression to make that space, take up less space. Compression is making files smaller. There's two types of compression, lossy and lossless. Lossy compression is when you use it on images and sound usually, and it permanently removes data from the file. This could be by reducing the resolution or the color depth or the number of samples that you take per second. This actually limits the number of bits the file has and reduces its size. The best thing about a lossy compression is it's got a much larger compression rate. The disadvantages is you have obviously a reduced quality and the data is lost forever. With lossless compression, you can only really use this on files where you do not need the information. So in other words, if you try to use lossy compression on a text file, the data would be lost and you can't get it back again. So lossless compression is when you temporarily remove the data, but you can then restore it back to its original state. The good thing about lossless compression is you can get the data restored and you will have better quality. The disadvantage is you've got much less compression. Next, we look at some environmental issues. So when we are using IT equipment, such as mobile phones and computers and tablets and consoles, they all use something called natural resources. They contain a lot of raw materials. Things like plastic is made from crude oil, which will eventually run out. Devices often have precious metals in, like gold, silver, copper, and mercury. And most of those things only occur naturally in tiny quantities. Eventually, these might run out. To extract these metals, we use a lot of energy, which again affects the environment. So in other words, just to create these devices, we have a lot of pollution created and we're running out of natural resources. We also need to consider the use of energy. Most electricity is made using non-renewable resources at the moment, like coal, oil and gas. Obviously, extracting all the resources like we've talked about and actually using the devices uses electricity, which means we are helping to increase pollution. All computers generate heat and require cooling. All the big powerful servers where all your data is held use lots of electricity and have special air conditioning to keep them cool. Finally, e-waste is a huge problem. The world creates 20 to 50 million tons of e-waste per year. Essentially, it's old electronics that you just want to throw away. Most modern devices have a short life before they're thrown away due to upgrade or breakage. A lot of the time this is down to the manufacturers because they only give short warranties and people usually get pushed to upgrade rather than repair things. Next we look at the legal issues. The first law that we need to consider is the Copyright Designs and Patents Act. The Copyright Designs and Patents Act is from 1988 and it was introduced to protect intellectual property. Intellectual property is anything that somebody's created. This could be a song, a piece of software, an invention, a book, a film, a video game, anything at all that you've created. This law makes it illegal to copy or share these files without permission. Next is the Data Protection Act, which makes it illegal to share people's data, and you must protect it or be heavily fined and lose reputation. There are 8 principles for the Data Protection Act, but I recommend remembering 2 at least of them. The main one is that you need to keep data safe and secure. It is your responsibility to do that. And the other one is make sure that you are using the data for what you've said you're going to use it for. In other words, if you ask somebody for information about themselves and say that you're using it for a particular purpose, you can't then go and do it for something else. And the final law that you need to know is the Computer Misuse Act. The Computer Misuse Act is from 1990 and it's basically to stop hackers and cybercrime. It makes it illegal to hack, to create viruses and try and spread them, or to try and steal or destroy a network.